There we go. Good morning, everyone. Never seen so many developers awake so early in the morning before, so hopefully that goes well. My name's Satyen. Like Eric mentioned, I work on the YUI team. And they let me out today to come here and talk about YUI. YUI is pretty broad, though, in terms of the scope of modules it has. So my goal for this talk is to whittle it down to a subset of modules which hopefully will be useful to you guys, to hackers. And not just your regular kind of run-of-the-mill hackers, but hackers who have really tight time constraints, maybe a couple of biological constraints too. So that's the goal of this talk, to whittle down YUI to something you can use over the next 24 hours. Just in case I don't make it all the way through the talk, that URL pretty much has everything you need. I'll be covering stuff from there. We'll also be tweeting a URL for the deck. It's a browser-based deck, so you can use that for reference as you go through your hacks over the next 24 hours. I have a ton of stuff to cover. I'm probably going to run long, so I'll jump straight in. I might have to rush through certain pieces, but I'll be around, so feel free to ping me if you need details on any more of this stuff. So let's start with the basics. To use YUI, the first thing you need to do is put the seed file script on the page. A key thing to note there, I think, is that I'd recommend sticking with 3.9.1. It's been out there for a while. 3.10 came out a couple of days ago. So for the purposes of hacking, I'd recommend just sticking with 3.9.1, and you don't run into any unexpected issues that way. Once you have that seed on the page, what that gives you is a YUI constructor. And you can use that to create your own version of the library. I won't get into too much detail about what that means for mashups. But basically, as you add more and more YUI code to the page, it makes sure that you're not messing with something going on in another instance. So once you create that instance, you can ask it to load whichever modules you're using in your hack. In this case, for example, we're loading overlay. You can ask it to load more stuff, for example. And once all that stuff is loaded, it'll invoke that callback function you have, and all your hack code can go into there. So by the time overlay is loaded, it has a y.overlay set up, and that Y instance is your version of the library to work with. So now you've got YUI on the page. The next thing you're probably going to want to do is mess with the DOM. So for that, you include the node module. That's our wrapper for native HTML elements. And once you do that, you have y.node available to you, and you have a selector for single instances you can work with, and a selector or a method you can use for multiple instances. The first one gives you a node instance back. The second one gives you a node list instance back. And more or less, they're pretty much identical, but the list interface has stuff you can use to iterate with, for example. You can use any type of selector you want to get access to the elements you need. Next thing to touch on is how to create elements. And so you have a y.node.create method, and you can pass in any HTML to that method. It can have nested elements. It can have multiple elements. And we'll give you a node reference back. It'll either be a single reference if there's a top-level element, or a document fragment if there's multiple. And then finally, you have the familiar methods you're already used to actually add that stuff to the DOM. Beyond the basics we looked at there, once you get a node instance back, I think a couple of key things to keep in mind is in order to work with what you'd normally use dot properties for in native HTML elements, when you're working with a YUI node instance, you'd use set and get. Set to set the dot property, and get to retrieve it. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. Methods are methods, so there's nothing really to go into there. And then there's a couple of helpers to work with styles and classes. So you can use all of that stuff to start working with the DOM on the page. In addition to the set of methods we just looked at, which are primarily kind of mirrors of the native HTML element API, we also have a bunch of value-added functions. So methods you can use to work with page-based positioning, for example, the setXY and getXY, dimensioning, simple show hide sugar on top of elements, the ability to load URL content into elements, that kind of stuff. So for all of this, I'd recommend going to YUI library, looking at the API docs, and you'll get a really clear idea of what you can do with node instances. In addition to the methods we're looking at up here, Those are available on all node instances. You also have the ability to conditionally add value to a particular node instance. So for example, if you're doing something like infinite scrolling in your hack, you can pull down the scroll info plugin and add scroll information to the element you're trying to do infinite scrolling with. So there's various modules you can use and play with to get more out of the DOM subsystem. Okay, so that was kind of getting YUI on the page, setting up the boilerplate, working with the DOM. Next thing we'll move on to is DOM events. And again, excuse the rush here. I'm trying to get this done in 20 minutes. In all of these slides, what I'll be using for boilerplate for that use statement we looked at is the module. So to use events, you'd pull in the node module and the event module. And that'll give you your regular on method to subscribe to events, nothing that fancy to discuss there. That'll give you access to all the DOM events, let you subscribe to them. Another interesting one to look at is the once method. And that lets you listen for something once. So what happens is, under the hood, as soon as that listener is called the first time, it detaches itself, and you don't have to worry about doing that under the hood. The other interesting one to talk about is probably delegate. So that lets you set up event bubbling scenarios. You can say, I want to listen for click events at this top level container, and I'm only interested in events coming from this area of the DOM. And it'll do the filtering for you. And the only interesting thing to keep in mind there is that in your subscriber, target is just target like it always is. Container will be a reference to this div element which the delegate is bound to. And then current target will be the actual matching filter applied. So this is something useful to keep in mind. Also, like I mentioned, all this will be online, so you can use it to refer to it later. Just like the DOM stuff we looked at, in terms of events, we have the previous slide, which was your basic DOM events. And then we also have a bunch of value-added events you can play with. So if you've ever tried to do kind of mouse over, mouse out type of stuff, we have some sugar in terms of the mouse enter and mouse leave events, which you can use so you don't have to worry about target filtering when you're doing those kinds of applications. The other interesting sugar to talk about is our gesture layer. And that normalizes or abstracts pointing device specifics for you. So you can listen for flick or tap, and it'll get fired regardless of whether it's a touch device or a mouse-based device, essentially. And the payload will be normalized for you. And then the last one is kind of some input sugar. Again, there's a bunch of these events. Go to yuilibrary.com, and you can look through the API docs for more specifics on them. I'm around too. So that was the basics, kind of getting YUI on the page, working with the DOM, working with DOM events. And that gives you all the basics to do your DOM type of stuff. I think the next thing you're probably going to want to do is retrieve data. And the big daddy of data retrieval is YQL. So YUI has a YQL wrapper. Again, YQL is the module you'll end up using if you want to use YQL. It'll give you a static YQL method to call. You feed in your query, you get your results back. They're already parsed and formatted as a JavaScript object, to work with. I won't go into too much detail on how to figure out the queries and the return values, but Gaurav, who's up later, will be touching on some of that stuff hands-on with the console. I think the interesting part about YQL from the YUI angle is that that same piece of code can run anywhere. So you could run it on Node.js, it'll work. You could run it inside Win8 apps, it'll work. And there's some interesting pieces about the YUI infrastructure which lets that happen, again, outside the scope of this 20 minutes. But if you want to ping me offline, I can give you some details about how that all works. Under the hood, if you need to debug anything, this is what actually ends up getting sent to YQL. The interesting thing to note is the format is JSON, so it already does that for you by default. You can flip any of these switches, by the way. So that's YQL and YQL's wrapper, an easy-to-use thing. You can simply use it. If you have a service you're trying to work with which doesn't have a YQL front end to it, you can go down a level and use JSONP directly. Same kind of syntax, you'd use the JSONP module. The only key things to call out here is remember to put the callback is equal to callback token in, so your callback actually gets invoked. And as always with JSONP, only use it with trusted sources. So if you're going out to my porn warehouse or something with your hack, remember not to host your hack somewhere sensitive. So that was YQL, JSONP as two methods to get data. The last method worth talking about is IO, which is our XHR wrapper. And the key reason that I guess you'd want to use that in your hack is if you need more granular control, for example. So with IO, you can figure out why a request failed, branch based on that. You have access to when the request started, when it completed, that kind of stuff. So that's when you'd use IO if you want to. It also has a bit of extra sugar. If you have a form on the page, for example, and you want to mine it and send out a request in the background, IO can do that pretty easily just by pointing to the form. If you end up using IO, there's a couple of helper methods to let you parse the raw strings which come back based on the data types you're using. So just a quick pointer to those. And there's a couple more out there too, which you can look at. So that was getting YUI on the page, getting data, and that's kind of the first steps in your hack. Once you're done with that, in order to win the $5,000, pounds, I forget which it was, you want to start having things look pretty. Right? And so YUI has a CSS-based infrastructure to let you do that. To start working with that, the first thing to do is kind of normalize what the browser thinks is pretty. This will set a baseline for you, so you're not fighting against it throughout your hack. And it'll do it consistently across browsers. Once you have that, you can start adding your own idea of pretty on top of it. Right? So YUI has some CSS-based modules. All you do is put them on the page, mark your HTML, and it becomes prettier. Forms, buttons, popovers, same kind of thing. We also have a responsive grids infrastructure. Again, same kind of usage. You put the HTML on your page, you set up class markers, and it'll make responsive grids for you. There's also a tool you can use. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go there right now, but it'll let you do that through the tool. So if you're building a cross-device hack, for example, and you want responsive control in it, go ahead and use the responsive grids. In order to help avoid figure out which modules you need when, because some of these are in the core YUI library, some of them in the gallery making their way towards YUI, you can just pick up that entire link and dump it on your page, and you can use any of the infrastructure we just looked at on the previous slides. And documentation for that set of infrastructure is here. Again, I'll avoid jumping there for now. Last thing worth discussing, this I will jump to. So on top of the infrastructure we just looked at, we have a rather cool skin builder. And what that lets you do is take any of the out-of-the-box visualizations in YUI and customize them for a particular color palette. So these are the set of widgets YUI has, and we'll get to that listing a little bit later. This is the set of CSS utilities we just looked at, for example. And you can play with the skin builder to build a custom palette. And it's intelligent enough to figure out when it has to flip text colors, for example, to leave things visible. So you can see text flipping from black to white, for example, where required. And you can also mess with schemes. So you can say, I want a primary scheme and then a complementary scheme for anything else. So it's a pretty powerful tool. It actually uses a y.color utility to do a lot of the color math. So you have access to that too. Once you're done playing with it, you can take the CSS from here and dump it onto your page on top of the YUI CSS, and that'll give you your color scheme. So I think that's about it in terms of making stuff look pretty with just CSS. There's a couple of things you can leverage to make things look pretty with JavaScript. One is our transition API. And that lets you get kind of cross-browser transitions. I'm not sure too many people care about getting things to work on IE6 in this environment, but if you want to, it will, essentially. The key value add you get from it is the callback, so you can kick off transitions and then have it call back to your callback and clean up after it's done. There's the anim utility, and the reason you'd use that instead of transition would be if you want tween events, for example. So if you want to keep things in sync with an ongoing animation, you could use anim and listen in for tween events to keep things in sync while the thing is animating. And the other useful little piece of sugar it has built in is the ability to animate along a curve. So if you're using any of those things, move to anim from transition. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of making things look prettier with JavaScript is the 2D graphics library. So if you're doing that kind of work, you can look at the graphics library, look at the API and stuff available for it. There's a couple of really neat examples on yuilibrary.com which you can look at for that. It'll choose the right rendering technology under the hood based on your browser, so you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So that's making things look pretty with JavaScript or with CSS. Next thing you probably want to do is figure out how to have multiple views in your app if you're building a more complex app for the hack. And YUI has a single page app infrastructure for that. It actually flows all the way from a simple hackable tool all the way to a complex, maintainable, large-scale application. And I was actually hacking on this yesterday night. I haven't really worked with it hands-on that much. And I found that the stuff on YUILibrary.com got a little bit complex in terms of it was targeting the right way to build stuff for the long term, server-based routing and that kind of stuff. So what I did was kind of highlight some of the stuff for you, which makes sense. You define your app, you define your views. Once you've done that, you can define what exists in your views through the handlebars templates, and then create an instance, a view instance based on it. And again, you'll have all this for reference, so you can use it as a template if you want to. And once you've done that, you can actually define app flows and navigate to them, and it'll have back button support built in. I think I've got time to jump here. So yesterday night, I put this together just while I was experimenting with it. Let me jump out of full screen mode here so you can see the URLs. So it's a quick, it's got a home page that jumps to a user's page, and it has inbuilt transitions which you can override to change that. And it has a parent-child relationship, so it'll use one transition for just parent-to-parent changes, and then another transition for parent-to-child changes. So you can see it's pretty straightforward to get something up and going, and the link to this template will be in the talk, so you can use it as a baseline to work with if you need to. So that's app flows. We've got a bunch of widgets, and I think I've got time, so I might jump into some JS bin stuff here. We've got a bunch of widgets which you can look at shipped out of the box. There's also a ton of them in the gallery. So take a look at those. They might be useful for your app, and you can customize the look and feel of them based on that skin builder we looked at. I'll actually leave the coding till the end, see if we've got time. So that's the widget stuff. In terms of using the widgets, and like I said, we'll try and code this up if there's time at the end. The pattern to use them is pretty similar. You use the module required, you create a new instance of the widget, you feed in your attributes which you want to construct it with. The unique thing to call out here is that you can listen for changes in any of these attributes using the after method. So once you've created your slider, for example, you can do a slider.after. Listen for any changes in this value attribute by using the value change event and react to it. So if you wanted to hook up the slider to an input field, for example, you'd do it through something like this. Aside from all that stuff we've already looked at, there's a ton of other stuff, some of it more suitable, again, to kind of the longer-term maintainable coding aspect. But feel free to browse around, use whatever you need to from the library. The cache, for example, might come in useful for some of the hacks. I think that's about it. So in conclusion, everything we've looked at so far has been focused on giving you something to use in the short term. So something you can use in 24 hours to get something up and going. Kind of the jQuery equivalent, if you will. I think what YUI is really suited at is the second use case. So taking that implementation and extending it into a long-term maintainable product, essentially, which you can use across developer groups, across locations, and you have a maintainable code base to work with. And there's a bunch of stuff all centered around there, which I won't get into today, but if you're interested in any of that stuff, again, feel free to ping me as I'm walking around, and we can get into some details of that stuff. I think that's about it. Questions? Yep.
Do you think we're working with video?
Good question. We don't. Do you have anything to work with video was the question. I guess I'm done. Oh, there's one in the back. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so the transition API under the hood, and this is true for all of YUI, so the goal is to maintain a standard API, and under the hood we'll choose the right implementation. So that mydiv.transition you looked at, in capable browsers under the hood it'll use CSS3, and in browsers which don't support it, it'll fall back to JavaScript timers. And again, like the YQL example, that's true for everything essentially. Yeah. Yeah. We do, yeah. So again, I think one of the key distinctions for YUI is we don't have a YUI mobile and a YUI server. Let me flip to the next slide and that'll give you somewhere to look at. We don't have a YUI server and a YUI mobile and a YUI desktop and in future YUI TV, for example. Our belief is that it's all the same. It's the same stack. So for example, the UI you'd want on a TV actually is pretty much the same as the UI you'd want on a mobile device, essentially. And so our idea is to have the same API and then change out implementations under the hood as required. And the downside to that in a lot of environments is that you're shipping more code. With YUI, one of the powerful features is we have a conditional loading infrastructure. So when you do a use YQL, for example, under the hood, it'll pull down a specific implementation for Node.js if it discovers that it's running on Node.js. If it's running in Win8, it'll download an implementation for Win8. So it'll try and optimize the payload for you based on environment. And the reason I popped this up is so if you go to supported environments, I can actually do that right now since I've got some time. That's kind of what we support at the base level, and that's what we test on for each release. Yeah.
What are the advantages of Bootstrap?
So Bootstrap, I think that was the key point is what I was mentioning. So the CSS infrastructure we looked at is kind of on par with Bootstrap, I'd say. But then once you have that in place, the patterns you use there can be extended to JavaScript and everything else. So it's kind of, you can start there, but then move your way up to a full-fledged maintainable app, which lasts across 4 years, and apply those same principles. The other thing is that with Bootstrap and things like that, you find yourself building up products with multiple micro libraries. And so everything, you might have repeated event systems, for example, or repeated DOM systems with different APIs. And so with something like YUI or even Dojo, for example, you get a consistent API across anything, whether you're dealing with MVC apps or widgets or even DOM stuff. It's all the same API. It's driven by kind of shared infrastructure underneath. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry? That's a good question, too. So a lot of it is driven by Yahoo's data. So Yahoo gets a ton of visitors, and we collect that data and figure out what the most ideal set of browsers is based on that. And which is why, for example, we still support the older IEs, because there's a significant set of users coming in from other parts of the world which still have those browsers. Oh, in the back again. Yeah. Yep. I'm sorry, can you, the fan. Okay, gotcha. So out of the box, so in terms of the UI elements, I think you're talking about the widgets, for example. Is that correct? So in terms of the widgets, we don't have an out-of-the-box mobile offering right now. In the gallery, there's a mobile-based UI infrastructure which is built on top of this, which takes some of those widgets and gives them a mobile look and feel. I think the thing we're wrestling with there is what do we ship? So if we ship something, it might look like iOS interaction, for example, but it will look out of place on Android. And so that's part of what we're trying to deal with. But again, the skinning infrastructure can help you deal with that to a certain extent. Yeah. I think we'll wrap it up. I have 22 seconds left. I thought I'd be running over. So again, I should be around all 24 hours. I'm getting old, so I don't know if I can stay awake for all that time, but I should be around. If you can't see me, feel free to contact me on any of those. Twitter is probably not a good idea. I haven't used it in like 3 years. My last tweet was 3 years ago probably, and that wasn't very useful either. So IM is fine too for these 24 hours. Feel free to ping me. And that's about it. I think there's something Zen-like with being able to start with a bathroom reference and end with one too. So we'll wrap it up there.
All right. Let's hear it for Satyen.
Thank you guys.
All right.